Well, I first want to thank Eduardo for inviting me to join you today. It's always a pleasure to speak about my version of industrial archaeology, which is really a combination of railways, not so much telegraphs, and eventually in steamships. But I also want to talk today about archaeology, I guess I would call it agricultural archaeology. Because what I'm trying to do to illustrate for you some of my research, hope that you're interested in, is to help you understand how railways contributed, one, to globalization, the globalization of food markets or foodstuffs, not so much that, but then how the railway and steamships and telegraphy had a very strong impact on agriculture, and I'm going to use the example of England today. Basically, this underlying story is railways made the transport of agricultural goods much more efficient, much faster, longer distances. But steamships could carry a bushel of American wheat in the 1870s to Liverpool, taking the railway from the Middle West, the famous Middle West of the United States, Iowa, Kansas, so forth, bringing it to New York on trains, putting it on a ship, sending it to Liverpool, and it was sold in England at less than English farmers could produce it. Okay? So what did that do to the price of wheat, for example? So that touched off what's called the agricultural crisis in Great Britain. And it meant that people who made their living, farmers who made their living by growing cereal grains, particularly wheat, who were very prosperous during the 1850s, 60s, and early 70s, really fell into hard times. Okay, so the railway and the connection between railways and steamships, and of course telegraphy is, the way that the people who buy and sell can have instant kind of information to follow the markets. So all over England, or at least particularly in the grain-growing regions of England, you see a real a crisis and the eventual change out of the great contraction of wheat production and the expansion into other things that could be sold at a price that could keep a family together. On the other hand, the part of the story I want to tell you today, too, is about how if the railway taketh away, in a sense of assisting foreign competition, the railway also giveth, with the other hand, because in the case of the county I'm dealing with, and it's called Wiltshire, it promoted the expansion of dairy farming, particularly in fresh milk. Fresh milk is not a product that can be shipped easily from the United States or any other place. So that was an option that many farmers who did a little bit of grain, did a little bit of cattle, something like that, took up, even smaller ones, with the assistance of high-speed transportation that would take a ton of milk to London, for example. Now, the rates were pretty slow at first. In the 1860s, it took about 10 hours. You can kind of imagine what was happening to the milk. But by 1900, the same journey of a milk can took 2 hours. And that's a whole part of the story that I'm working on, and another project on infant mortality because of the contamination of milk. So here we have England that I'm going to tell you about, and this is Wiltshire. Okay, so these are the main cities of England and so forth. I won't go over them, but this is London, this is Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and so forth. Now, some of you may know this monument. If you're interested in archaeology, this is real archaeology. This is Stonehenge, which is one of the great landmarks of Wiltshire. So this is a kind of help to help you get your bearings. Where are we? We're not going to study the Druids or whoever did build these things, but this is part of the landscape that is Wiltshire. So is this. This is the chalk horse of Wiltshire, which is also very ancient, and it's carved into limestone, or the English call it chalk. Okay? So what I'd like to do, just to quickly, I don't want to spend too much time because I know it's after lunch and your attention is only so it's only so much. But I want to talk about industrial archaeology in the sense of at least naming one of the great railway engineers, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was the chief designer and motive force behind one of Britain's great landmark railways, which was called the Great Western Railway, and how that railway eventually encouraged the expansion of the milk trade, probably also the decline of the wheat trade, but it also transformed the city, or the village, from about 2,000 people into a huge town where railworks were established. And for the agriculture, one of the reasons I'm interested in Wiltshire is that I read an article doing some other research by a commentator that day. His name was Richard Jeffries. And he was a bit of a nature writer, but also he was a friend of the farmers. And when the agricultural crisis struck in England and Wales and Scotland also, he wrote articles promoting one or another scheme to help the English farmer compete with those nasty Americans. So we're going to talk a little bit about him, and his story is in part a reaction to, or his observations or reactions to the crisis in wheat, but he didn't really mention much at all about the growth of milk, and we'll talk about that. So here is one of our heroes, and this is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, born in Portsmouth in 1806, the naval base, home of Dominic, who will speak next, I guess. And this is in front of the, I think these are the chains in front of the steamship called the Great Britain, and it's just an iconic photograph of this new hero of the industrialized age. He's not a banker, he's an engineer, he's brilliant. In some ways, he was elected when he was about 22 to the Royal Society. He was nobody's dummy. And here he is posed in front of works that this is the anchor chain for the Great Britain. This is the way he's immortalized today in Swindon, his statue. So I'll show, now we'll go quickly to Swindon. Well, first, the Great Western, the first line of the Great Western, ran from London down to Bristol. And it went right through the kind of northern part of Wiltshire County. And Swindon is this dock right here. And it was designated as the rail works for the Great Western Railway. What happened at the rail works? Well, what happened when, this is the expansion of the village with about the it says 1849, but here you can see the footprint of industry. This is rail industry on a very large scale for its time. I think, I know Dominic would know, I think it's the first rail works outside of London and Manchester, but well, that's not here or there. The illustration of the 1850s sort of heralds the new technology that's being instituted and functioning in Swindon, the rail works, forges, all kinds of stuff. And here's the locomotive assembly and construction hall. So it is really quite an astonishing accomplishment for its day. This man was born outside of Swindon, maybe 5 miles. And it's so ironic because, I think, because in his writings, he barely mentions railways, except to criticize them. Here he writes this article called The Steam on Country Roads. And the point of his article was to, he was a booster of agriculture, and he said, well, American farmers are well served by railways at every little nook and cranny, every farm gate almost. Whereas the poor British farmer has to truck his products up to 10 miles, he claimed. And that doesn't make it possible for us to compete. And so he had, in this article, he has a fanciful remedy. Instead of building railways right to the farm gate, he's proposing to put railways, pretty much, on wheels that can roll along country roads so that they can go to one farm, pick up the products, go to the next, and so forth. It's a kind of a far-fetched idea. Anyhow, he's really interesting because he's provocative. He illustrates the kind of effort by proud Englishmen to preserve their agriculture in the face of foreign competition. And these maps are a little small, but this is, the point I want to try to make is that he was writing in the 1880s, and even then, the accessibility, call it that, of rail transportation in Wiltshire County was really quite good. So here you have the 1840s. These are pretty small to see, but there are little dots here for stations, and these are the rail lines. Once we get into the 1900s or even the 1880s, this is pretty much the full extent of what will be the Wiltshire Railway network. And this is probably very difficult for you to see, I'm sorry to say, but this is an attempt to map out the maximum distances, or the average distance from a parish center. I don't know what the equivalent is in
Phrygia.
To the nearest railroad station. So this is where you could get your product. So basically, from your distance, it's very difficult to see. But the average was about 3 miles. That's not a long way for a cart to go, particularly since carts made much, much longer trips before the railway. And the maximum distance in these areas that are shaded dark was about 8 miles. Okay? So even though he was a very careful observer, he seemed to be willfully, perhaps, ignorant of the very rail system that he grew up in the shadows of, let's say. Now, this, unfortunately, is a difficult one to see also. What I'm trying to show here is how the dairy industry grew both by intensifying in certain regions and expanding into other regions. And so this is a map of 1871. And the darkest areas are those areas where the density of milk cows is the highest. Okay? And you can see right away that there's a kind of a long historical division in Wiltshire between grain growing in the east, and this used to be cheese country, or milk before the rail transport tended to be transformed into cheese. Do you have any idea why? Because Englishmen love cheese, right? No, because of course you could transport cheese very slowly. You could get it to a market and it wouldn't spoil, that kind of stuff. But when it comes to fresh milk, you have to get it there pretty quickly. And so we see, so the basic thing is, even though they're hard to read, if you study this closely, trust me, you will see that as the number of rail stations expanded, so did the area in which there are high densities of dairy farming, okay, or milk cows, until you get to 1901. So you have a progression here. And it's really important because the Great Western Railway was perhaps not completely unique, but was very prominent in its encouragement of the milk industry. When in the 1860s, many of the railway companies decided they were not going to give any preference to milk, to carrying milk, because it was expensive, not so much profit, and so forth. And so distant areas were not privileged. The Great Western Company, Great Western Railway, had a different idea. You know, every city, I'm sure Porto and Lisbon and so forth, in the 1850s, probably had a dairy enclave. Dairy farmers close to the markets of Porto or Lisbon producing milk that could be transformed into cheese, but also could be taken to the market without spoilage. The same thing happened in all the European countries. And in London, the so-called London milk shed, that's the characterization of all those surrounding areas of London that produced milk for retail sale. The Great Western, in its effort to increase its own profits, changed the rates of its charge for transporting fresh milk. It charged people in the London area more to transport a gallon of milk to London than it did for farmers in Wiltshire. Now, of course, today that would be a hue and cry, and you know, the judge would say, well, that's not fair, or whatever. There were always complaints about railway pricing. But nonetheless, that gave the upper hand, you might say, or a benefit, a seriously important benefit to the producers of fresh milk in Wiltshire. I won't go into anything more, but there were improvements in the speed to facilitate the milk trade. There was the improvement of receiving areas at Paddington Station, which is in London, where the Great Western Terminus was. But to give you an idea, I think I already told you, it took about 10 hours to get a gallon of milk from Swindon to London in 1865 or 1870, and it took 2 hours in 1900. So there you see. Now, there are other ways where we can deceive ourselves by looking at maps and saying, well, gee, look, there are rail lines and stations here and so forth. Doesn't it look like there's an association? There are methods to do this, and one of them is called geographically weighted regression, but I'm not going to bore you with that. But suffice it to say that the distance from the rail transportation had a significant influence in in this expansion, okay? Not an astounding finding, but it's at least one. Go through this. Real briefly, this is the opposite story, where you have this, the dark areas here, this is wheat production in 1871, before the great invasion of American wheat. This is Wiltshire after the great invasion, or during what's called the agrarian, or the agricultural depression. So you can see the great contraction and diminution of wheat production, because even if people grew wheat, continued to grow wheat, they would give it to their animals for the most part, because they couldn't compete. Well, let me leave you with, gee whiz, where is it? Oh, well, this, too bad this is so dark. I just want to leave you with an image of, I don't know, food for thought or whatever about industrial archaeology. Because I haven't really spoken, except for Brunel, about the human element in industrial archaeology. And it's sad to say, you can't see this, but this is a woman worker who cleaned the barrels, who cleaned the boilers at Swindon. Now, it's not in the 1860s. This is in 1942-43, when women, because of World War II, took up so much of the labor of men. Anyhow, so I leave you with that. Humans count in agricultural archaeology and industrial archaeology. Thank you.